Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to the St. Mary's County Library program, Charlotte Hall Academy, from Roger B. Taney to Sly Stallone. My name is Allison Guy, and I work for the St. Mary's County Library System. I actually work at the Charlotte Hall Library, so I'm especially interested in this talk because we're going to be talking about local history. Okay, so our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Jim Gibb, and he's done some archaeological research on the Charlotte Hall Academy. And Jim, do you have anything to add before we get started? All right, perfect.
All right, well, let's share screen here. Well, good to see you folks this evening. Glad you could join us. I'm going to be talking about a project I did, I think, back in 1989. Um, and it was precipitated, it was at the what's now the Charlotte Hall Veterans Home. It was precipitated by the proposed demolition of one of the old academy buildings. The academy closed in 1976. Some years later, was converted into what we now know as the Charlotte Hall Veterans Home. So this is a photograph of a long demolished administration building. You'll notice the colonial accents to it. So the academy was located right near the borders of Charles, St. Mary's, and Calvert counties, and that wasn't an accident. It was supported by uh, the then, I guess you would call it, proprietary government of Maryland in 1774, and after the Revolution by the state of Maryland. And folks intended the academy to serve those three counties, Calvert, Charles, and St. Mary's. So it was ideally situated for all. If you go out to the academy, I think today, frankly, I've just driven through it, I think maybe last year briefly with a crew in the car, but I haven't spent any time on the site in many years. But assuming things haven't changed an awful lot, the main buildings you see today are the White House, the upper left-hand corner, the Dent Memorial Chapel, upper right-hand corner, and the Veterans Home itself. And the building immediately to the left is the one that was demolished soon after we were finished with our work. So just a few details of the history. The school had been planned in the 1770s, and a board of trustees was created. They met in 1774. I think they met again in the 1780s, but basically the school was not built and opened until 1797, over 20 years later. Now, partly it's because, 1774, we were about to begin a revolution against king and parliament. And after the war ended, after the peace treaty was signed, 1783, the colonies were really in an economic depression because all kinds of economic relationships had been ruptured. There's all kinds of debt to fund the war, so things weren't going very well in Maryland and elsewhere in the colonies throughout the 1780s. So folks finally got together in the 1790s. The first school hall was built in 1793. It burned in 1843. A wing to the hall was constructed in 1801. It also burned in 1843. And then the superintendent's, or the White House, was built in 1803, and that's the image I just showed you. Gambrel roof, Georgian style structure, and it's still there. And then the classroom building, which was built in 1857, burned in 1896. That's what my focus will be this evening. Charlotte Hall School transformed into a military academy in 1852. And I really haven't done much archaeology on that academy period, so I'm not going to say a lot about it. Again, it did close in 1976. In 1852, we were soon out of the Mexican War. where I understand American troops behaved deplorably. Their commanding officers thought they behaved poorly, including Robert E. Lee and I think Ulysses S. Grant. Um, and so there was, I think, an interest in training future officers for the military. This is also a period, the 1850s, a great deal of tension, North versus South. Be interesting to see how many of these academy graduates from the late 1850s, who they served with, North, South, or did they just beat it to Europe? There's been this persistent tale that Chief Justice Roger Taney, known mostly for the so-called Dred Scott decision, where it basically said, Africans, slaves weren't citizens and therefore didn't have the rights of citizens. He was born in 1777 in Calvert County, not far from Benedict. You can actually get out and see his house site. It's not a public site, but the property's there. Thing is, he graduated from Dickinson College in 1796 at age 19, which was not unusual. College graduates graduating at that age. He would not have been going to this academy in 1797. So he's definitely not an alumnus. Sylvester Stallone, on the other hand, we know was there in 1961, just for 1 year. Why he didn't continue, I don't know. I think his brother was with him too. So that's our claim to fame, Sly Stallone. This is a recent image of the Veterans Home, which I think has changed somewhat since I worked there. But up in the upper part of the screen, you can see the site of Dent Chapel. Below that, you could see the White House. And the other site I'm going to be talking about is located roughly in this area. The Academy was formed at a time when there was a great deal of interest in trying to educate at least the children of elite citizens in Maryland. By elite, I mean, wealthy and well-connected commercially and politically. So there were a creation of colleges. We have King William's College, now called St. John's, founded 1742, and where many prominent citizens received their education. Washington College, founded in the 1740s. We also have William and Mary down in Richmond. So there's interest in creating these colleges. But in order to get to college, you had to pass exams. It's not like it is today, where you submit your grade point average and letters of recommendation, that sort of thing, but you don't actually sit, in most cases anyway, for an exam. Well, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, you sat for an exam. And a major part of that exam was how well you did in the classical languages, particularly Latin. And so in order to learn classical languages, you went to an academy. Charlotte Hall was one such school. I think Anne Arundel Free School, the building survives, a little bit west of Annapolis. I think it was founded on the same principle, to provide an education for boys and to prepare them for essentially college entrance examinations. We have an advertisement here from the Reverend Neil Shaw. His name will pop up a little later this evening. But here he's saying the trustees of said school, Charlotte Hall School, will receive applications for an appointment of an assistant teacher or the assistant master in the Latin language on Thursday, the 1st of October. Next, the salary attached to that appointment is £135 per annum, which isn't bad for the day. So, they're teaching classical languages, Greek, classical Greek and Latin. They're teaching modern languages, usually French, Italian, and mathematics, mostly arithmetic, geometry, a gentleman should have the intellectual wherewithal, the skills to survey his own property. And also rhetoric, English, both reading and writing. So these are the basic skills one learns at, it's not quite a high school. It's sort of a prep school, but not a prep school as we see them today, perhaps. So again, it was founded at the northern end of St. Mary's County in Charlotte Hall. So this 1866 map of the area, let me get a detail here. There we go. So there's Charlotte Hall. You can see both the district, but also the community of Charlotte Hall, which is this nexus of roads, and in 1866, a proposed railroad. So again, an ideal place for schools serving the three counties because it was easy to get to. We have, using LiDAR, one of my favorite tools, we have what is now Maryland Route 5, but we also in green have the original Charlotte Hall Road that comes down and goes right up alongside the eastern side of the academy, but also a railroad. You can see in LiDAR, actually, the line isn't quite online. You can see a little bit of the railroad grade right here. So it parallels, for the most part, Charlotte Hall Road and would go right by Charlotte Hall. There'd be a railroad station there. Think, one of those stories they have in the movies with the witches and warlocks and same sort of thing. You get a special train coming through with all the students. But here you could see the train track, Charlotte Hall Road, the academy site, some houses. This is, I think, from 1894, thereabouts. Get it. And again, I think 1911. And you could see how their community is growing up around that nexus of roads and of the railroad. And you could see a small symbol with a cross on top. I don't think that's that Memorial Church. I think this large rectangle here marks the academy. And a 1943 or 44 USGS map, you can see the rail line still goes through. Actually, at this point, I think it was acquired by the United States Army or the Navy, the military, and a spur line curved off and headed over to what is now Patuxent Point Naval Air Station. The rail line didn't go much further south than Charlotte Hall, just went as far south as Mechanicsville, which is just set to the south. The grade for it was cut all the way down to St. Mary's City because there was another academy down there for young women. The male academies, they start in the mid-18th century. Academies for females, as far as I can tell, probably pretty much the 1830s, much later. And I don't know if I don't recall if I talked about in this series about the Tapscott Female Institute up in Ellicott City. But that's an example of one of those academies for young women that opened in 1837. And the idea there is, and most of those female academies was they were training the future mothers of the future fathers, future of our country. So that, kind of gives you an idea of what that educational program was like. For our academies, again, though, for men, they're really about preparing folks for college so they can go into one of the professions, ecclesiastical, medical, or legal. Those were pretty much where they went. With the military academies, the training tended to be much more towards engineering as it is today. And so very much a change in curriculum. In 1886, we have this plat that was drawn subdividing the land that was owned by the trustees for the Charlotte Hall Academy. And what they were clearly trying to do was sell land and use those monies to support the school. And they did it because they knew the railroad was coming through, as it did, I think, 2-3 years later. It wasn't the first attempt to plat off land for the academy. In 1803, Neil Shaw, who did that advertisement we looked at a moment ago, he, as a teacher of both English and mathematics, again, there's a strong land survey component to the mathematics that they're teaching, platted off a piece of the land, and you can see I've reconstructed it and showed where I think it belongs according to his original survey. I will point out, however, that it doesn't take into account magnetic declination. So one could perhaps rotate Neil Shaw's drawing about 6 or 7 degrees to the east, and it might actually fit orthogonally with the 1886 plat. Most of these lots were never sold. There were certainly houses around there that were built on those lots, but I don't think there was any real success there. So here's the map of the site as it looked when I was working there back, I think, in 1988, 1989. So you can see at the far end, the top of the screen, you see 1883. That's the Dent Chapel, Dent Memorial Chapel. And south of that, you got the 1851 gym and Keach Hall, and also 1803 would be the White House, which we've already seen. Various sorts of driveways and utility lines running through. Just a little bit of the Veterans Home shown here, opened in 1984, as I recall. South of that is this 1897 classroom building, which had been demolished before I got there. But it was pretty clear where it was located. You could actually more or less see the outline. And then further south of that is another building that was going to be demolished, the 1960 building here. So this is really what precipitated our work there, the proposed demolition of the 1960 building. What was the interest? Why work there? Well, some archaeological work had been done previously and stuff had been found. And I'll get back to that in a moment. So here you can see a 1930s photograph of the White House in kind of rough shape. I think the next photo really shows, they put this stupid dormer on here. It just looks terrible. But you can see the window panes broken out, and this building clearly had been abandoned at that point. It's my understanding that it was restored in 1938. And Dent Chapel, you can see here, as well as I think this is the new administration building showing up here. And the old administration building, which was demolished, I'm not quite sure when. And a view of the new administration building, which was demolished when the Veterans Home was built in 1984. So completely gone. This is a pretty massive building. I will say that you can Google Charlotte Hall Academy, and all sorts of alumni have posted photographs. It look like they're mostly from the 60s and 50s. And lots of views of this building, lots of views of the parade ground, sporting events, drilling, military drilling. But this building really figures prominently in a lot of those photographs. And the view we started off with the first slide, you could see it's got this sort of colonial style, almost gambrel roof and pediment with the chimney stacks. Got a very Georgian flavor to it. And an aerial view of the 1950s gym and Keach Hall, and off to the right you can see the chapel. What you can't really see very clearly is you've got the beginnings of, to the right of the screen, the beginnings of the sort of edge of the parade ground. Parade ground is going to be very important for a military academy. This is where they do their exercises um, for ceremonial events, and it really is sort of this big space in the middle of the campus. As an example, these guys are out on the parade ground, firing a salute to somebody, who knows, or duck hunting. So here I get into the archaeology. In 1982, an archaeologist named Donald Sutherland did some testing, and I haven't recovered his report yet, but he hit a bunch of brick rubble around the 1803 building. Very interesting. What was that rubble about? And there's been speculation, well, they needed brick clamps. They needed to make bricks to build the 1803 building, so maybe that's what it is. Down to the south, 2 years later, Dan Myers did a survey just south of the 1897 building, which again had been demolished by the time I got there. And he found a cluster of brick down here. So is that a brick clamp? Is it possible that's the original 1797 school building and the 1801 schoolroom addition? Now, before demolishing the 1960 building, inquiring minds wanted to know. And Julie King, who was the Southern Maryland regional archaeologist at the time, as I recall, she wrote up a scope of work that I bid on and got the project. But she wanted to explore this area here. There's nothing in the scope of work around the 1803 building because nothing was going to happen there. But down here, we did some close interval shovel testing, I think 20-foot intervals, really peppered the area around the 1960 building because it was going to be demolished, but also between it and the 1897 ruin because that's where Dan had found brick rubble. So here's a close-up view of it. I suspected we had, in fact, the 1857 school building. Remember the school, the 1797 building, the 1801 building, they burned in 1843. So there was no replacement until 1857 when the new school building was built. And as I recall, it had burned too in 1896. So this is likely that structure. We dug, let me go back for a moment. You can see the shovel test bits, little circles there, but we're going to focus on these 5-foot by 5-foot excavation units. Not only those down here, but we've got 3 of them within the 1897 building. One of those, and what I think is the 1857 building, Unit 4, we took it down, I don't know, about ½ foot, but this white area here represents undisturbed subsoil. Everything below it, this is brick rubble and soil. It looks, it's an archaeological feature. When we excavated this material, we drew a profile of this east wall here, and that's what's represented down below. So on the left, you can see that white area corresponding to the white area up here. That's undisturbed subsoil. Below the topsoil, we've got a little bit of brick rubble and soil. Below that, a lot of brick rubble and soil. And below that, we actually have a few large brick bats. Very few whole bricks, just rubble. This is a classic robber's trench. This is where somebody came along and dug a trench to remove the brick foundation in order to salvage the brick for another construction project. We know in 1896, the contractor, part of his contract was he had the option of salvaging brick from the old building to use in the new. So here's, I admit, a blurry picture of that east wall profile, but you could see the larger brick bats in the bottom and the brick rubble on top, and then some lighter colored soil that Yeah, as this slumped down, this filled in later on. But again, that's a classic robber's trench because you don't tend to find any whole bricks because they're salvaged. You find the stuff that they couldn't use with the rubble. This is a photograph of the bricks, some of the bricks that came out of there, including one largely whole brick with a little bit of lime mortar on it. All handmade. And so that came from this area here. But again, we also dug excavation units in the 1897 structure. And those are the kinds of bricks we found there, including a fair number of whole bricks. There's no indication that um, this this was destroyed relatively recently. Nobody was cannibalizing brick in the 1980s. But it's classic St. Mary's County brick that looks locally made. It's got a lot of these yellow limonite inclusions, nice sharp edges. Machines are used to make these things. The thing is, though, in the 1897 ruin, we found these bricks, but we also found some of the soft mud bricks identical to those that came out of Unit 4 and the other units down there. And to me, that shows that's our evidence that the contractor salvaged the brick from there and used them in the new construction. Now, he used them in places where you couldn't see them, places that didn't carry great loads, because brick, although you make them by burning them, if they burn again, if a building burns, that fire actually softens the brick. It makes them more friable. They lose their compressive strength. As a rule, they're not very useful, but you can use them in certain places out of sight where they away from water, because it's going to be very friable. They're going to absorb water. You can use them in a lot of places that don't require that they bear a great deal of load. The nails that came out of there, classic machine cut and wire nails. Machine cut nails from the 1857 building, wire nails from the 1897 building. So the nail chronology fits very nicely. So here's our 4 units. And again, you can see in each of them, there's a little bit of white area. And that white area represents undisturbed soil, whereas the stippled area, what should be bricks, that's fill. That's all rubble fill. And so we can apply a line around it, and that's our 1857 building. We don't have the western extremity. The shovel test pits around here suggest that it ends somewhere in this area, but we don't have the total footprint down. And of course, as no one has excavated this building, it's still there. It's still a rubble-filled cellar hole. Some of the things that came out of this building included, from a shovel test pit, we got a 22 caliber shell casing. We got a glass pipette, and we got a part of a glass graduated cylinder. So this is scientific and possibly military related stuff used possibly in this building, and probably more likely in the 1897 building, which housed science classes. So, I mentioned, okay, there's 2 original buildings that burned in 1843. What are the ramifications of that? These are from the census. And I've kind of snipped them and compiled them into slides. In each case, we have William T. Briscoe and Sarah A. Briscoe, ages 29, 27. He's a teacher. Below them, they've got a bunch of boys, 15 students, all boys ages 10 to 19. That tells us that in 1850, the Briscoes were boarding 15 students in their house. Because remember, the buildings had burned down. There's no longer really dormitory space for them. So another household, James Miltimore and his wife Anne. He's a teacher. They're much older, 56 and 55. And they have 9 students boarding with them, ages 9 to 20. And while we're at this, you'll notice where the students are from. They're all Charles, St. Mary's, and Calvert County. At the end of each, I always include the next household, just to show that that is, the end of that household, and this is a complete inventory of students. And then finally, the third household, Thomas C. Reeves and his wife Mary. He's 45, she's 39. He's a shoemaker. And yet in their house, they have six students boarding, 15 to 18, all boys. Interesting that they put the older boys in with the one person who's not really associated with the academy. They're just offering room and board to students. In 1860, we have a couple of the same people, the Briscoes, William and Sarah, 39 and 37. He's a teacher and a farmer. So he's got a side gig going. But there's nobody else in their household. The next census entry is for another household, and it's a farmer named Burroughs. We have a few houses down, Thomas C. Reeves and Mary. He's now the steward of Charlotte Hall College. They're calling it a college. But again, they have no borders. The next household, the next entry is for a physician, who is, I guess, their son. Yeah, it must be Reeves. And then finally, we have this guy Brown, who's the principal of Charlotte Hall College, and his wife Julia. They have only one other person living with them, and that's Clara McWilliams, 60 years old, styled a lady. This suggests that she's his mother-in-law or his mother. So we see from 1850, we've got these faculty boarding students. And then after 1857, after the new building's constructed, the kids go into their dormitories and these people get to have a life. That's kind of important for the academy because they make their money not just through tuition, they make it through providing room and board for students. So they've got basic room and board, a bed and food. And then there are always extras. You want your laundry done, that's going to cost extra. You want something special for your dinner, that's special. All those fees sort of accumulate. And really, that's how they make a lot of their money. It's not just tuition. Once the building is finished in 1857, they can start boarding students again. The other thing is with those censuses, there are only 30 students. I don't have the data in hand, but I suspect before 1843, there were a lot more students. And I think after 1860 and later, there were a lot more students. They run that school with just 30 students. So it really diminished their capacity to take on students. They probably had folks commuting in, but, we're still talking, horse and buggy. How far can you go to get to school? So again, here are these two areas we've looked at. So again, not really part of my brief here, but I was really interested, if this is the 1857 building down here, where are those two earlier buildings? We have 1803 up here. Don Sutherland found brick rubble up here. So basically, I went and took a look because I was curious. I think, first of all, what are we looking for? Well, the 1797 building was probably very similar to the 1803 building. They're gambrel roof, brick buildings, basically 2 stories with dormers, so you get some light in there, because that upstairs is dormitory space. That's where the students sleep. Down below are dining facilities and the room of the whatever faculty member was living there, in this case, the superintendent of the academy at one point. Keep in mind, this academy was around for 175 years. And so a lot of things changed. The curriculum changed, faculty and what they were teaching changed, the physical plant changed. And even a building like this was around 175 years during the lifespan of the academy. It probably underwent several uses before it became the superintendent's house. It was probably for a faculty member, possibly the principal of the school, again, with students upstairs. The descriptions in the records are really pretty good for these buildings. And so I reconstructed what I think they look like. On the left with the thick, dark lines, that would be the 1797 building. It looks like maybe it wasn't quite symmetrical. I can't quite tell. And then the school room to the right was just a big open space with hearths at each end and some windows. When we were working out there, it was a particularly dry summer, and it's hard to see. Around the middle of the image, there's some dark green grass, little space, and another dark green patch. And in this view, you could see it again, dark green here and here, with the White House over here. And with this dark green patch is even a bit of a ridge that runs across it around midway. I think that over here is the 1797 building and the 1801 wing coming off of it. And that's Den Chapel off to the side that didn't come around for decades later. So this is my interpretation of what's going on. We even popped a little hole in there. Probably weren't supposed to and shouldn't have, but it did. Just dug a shovel test pit, hit the rubble, and it wasn't just rubble. It wasn't just brick rubble. It was also lime mortar. So this is not a brick plant. We weren't making bricks here. This is a building. So this is my interpretation of essentially what the campus looked like in the early 19th century. This cluster of effectively 3 buildings in which faculty and the students lived and worked. It had to be incredibly claustrophobic. I mean, these people are living on top of one another. And then down here, we have our 1857 building. Charlotte Hall became a military academy in 1852, as you'll recall. So we have a very distinct change in the campus. We have this claustrophobic cluster up here, and then all these buildings disappear, and the next one is built way down here. It's at this point a military academy. This area here is probably parade ground before these other buildings were built in the late 19th century. So we see a real expansion of the campus. The amount of land is the same. I mean, they own a certain amount of land, but the placement of the buildings changed. And I think that represents the change in curriculum from a liberal arts school that, by liberal, meant non-denominational, wasn't a religious school, where they learned classics, ancient languages and modern languages, mathematics, English, probably some history. And the object here was to prepare them as essentially a preparatory school for one of the colleges, St. John's, William and Mary, Washington College. Before those colleges existed, a lot of the wealthier folks either sent their students up to the College of New Jersey, now Princeton, or up to Harvard or Yale, maybe colleges to the South. And Catholic families, especially earlier on, tend to send their children to Europe, particularly the continent, where they can go to a Catholic college. So, some research questions. How can we test what I just told you? How do we know that's true? How can we test that? It's an interpretation. based on, I think, pretty good evidence, but not slam dunk evidence. It's I think compelling, but not enough to really confirm that particular model of the campus prior to 1860. So how can we test that? Well, obviously with some excavations, or even with ground penetrating radar. Certainly the 1797 and 1801 buildings are probably, just light up on a radar. This 1857 building, I'm fairly confident we have, pretty close to the extent of the building. I'm not sure ground penetrating radar helps us that much in that particular situation. What we would want to do is do some substantial excavations, see if we can find some intact wall, see if how deep is this thing? Is there a full cellar to it? Where, for instance, they might have a kitchen. Is it a brick floor? What kinds of material are in that cellar that might tell us something about the furnishings of that building in the last half of the 19th century? Ground penetrating radar across the whole parade ground and everything might in fact find other buildings. We know that apart from these schoolrooms and whatnot, there were other outbuildings, and I don't think there's been no effort to identify them. Where are they? How are they built? The proceedings of the Board of Trustees for Charlotte Hall School and the Academy have been preserved. They are available. Not quite sure where they are now. I think they might be at the College of Southern Maryland. But those really warrant detailed examination, particularly by an archaeologist, because we're going to focus on, what buildings and what other features might be out there, but also about the changing pedagogy. How did how was the school run? At some, they relied periodically heavily on state aid. What was the nature of that aid? Was it for certain specific projects, or was it for what we call today operating costs? The construction of the new building in 1857, that's from the Academy period. It's about 400 feet south of the 1803 house. And that, again, suggests a much larger core campus. And that's important because it establishes a parade ground. If starting in 1852, there's a shift to basically, kind of ROTC, training young men for positions in the military as officers. That parade ground is a familiar part of pretty much any military post. That separation between administration and students, typical of any military post. Separation of officers and enlisted men, classic. So they're not only teaching military discipline, probably engineering and mathematics, but they're also kind of getting the students used to, what a military installation is like, how it's set up. I mean, most of you are familiar with these things. That military posts tend to be very expansive. They take up a lot of acreage, and there's a lot of open space for a lot of purposes, mostly training, but also ceremonial events. My go-to model is from the movie Stripes, comedy, where you see them out on the parade ground, both training but also for their graduation. We can see perhaps changes in the subject matter being covered. I suspect glass pipettes and graduated cylinders would not have been part of the equipment of the original Charlotte Hall School. They weren't doing chemistry, I'm pretty sure. But for the military academy, particularly in the later years, the sciences are going to be an important part of the curriculum. And so clearly we can look more for those kinds of objects, but also their distribution, where they found. And there ought to be shell casings all over the place that these folks have firing off these salutes. I don't think they were using 22 caliber rifles, but maybe. I don't really know much about armaments. Another interesting avenue of research, which I suggested at the time I wrote this report in the late 80s, based on work that Washington Lee University did at Liberty Hall in Virginia. And they were finding tobacco pipe fragments and marbles and gaming pieces. These all represent sanctioned activities that students were not supposed to engage in. And it makes me wonder, if we do enough work around an academy, will we find areas, secluded areas, where these kinds of objects are found, indicating that students are not complying with the rules. So particularly so during the military academy phase starting in 1852, when they're supposed to be teaching military discipline. For those of us not in the military, we perhaps don't quite understand that, but the shaved heads, the uniforms that all look alike, the parade formations, the walking in time, the marching in time, all that is about teaching discipline. Because if a military unit is in a situation under fire and that military discipline breaks down, that's catastrophic. That's when a lot of people end up dead. So that's really one of the most important things they're teaching at military academy. Makes me wonder why Sylvester Stallone went there in 1961. One might suspect that perhaps he was misbehaving, and the folks, sent him off to the military academy. So anyway, we can find these objects and look at their spatial distribution and see if we can learn something about comportment and how well the students complied with the rules and regulations of the academy. Now, again, there are board of trustee proceedings. There's all kinds of records. We can get some information about bad behavior. But what we can't get at is the bad behavior that wasn't discovered by the administrators. So there's certainly work to do there. Anyway, I think, that's all I have for this evening. Like I said, I think there's a lot more that could be done at Charlotte Hall. It is basically federal property, so you can't just go and dig. It requires getting a permit, an ARPA permit. But I think there's some interesting work that could be done, and also for ground penetrating radar, you don't need any permits for that. Just permission from the administrator of the veterans home, because it doesn't disturb anything. Just running what looks like a lawnmower over the lawn. But that could be very illuminating, especially around the 1803 building. So anyway, that's all I've got, and I'm open to questions. Yeah, but prep schools, I mean, they're still around today, and but the preparation of this particular academy, clearly changed right at mid-19th century. And so a historian really needs. We don't have a good academic history of Charlotte Hall, or as far as I know, of these academies in general. There's a master's thesis done many years ago on education in Maryland in the colonial era. I did a small piece on, one-room schoolhouses, but there's a lot that can be done with the history of education in this particular area. And archaeology can help inform that, but just some good academic history would really, I think, prove enlightening. Any questions, comments, complaints? I think this is going to be the last one till September. I am working on the September one now, though. It's going to be on Quarry Farm up in Elmira, New York. This is a place owned by a woman named Susan Langdon, whose brother-in-law was a guy named Samuel Clemens. Samuel Clemens used to spend his summers up there for about 30 years. And in a little building built just for him, he wrote Huckleberry Finn and other short stories. So this is another one where I'm reaching back. This is work I did in 1985, 86 maybe. So you can look forward to that, and I'll be coming up with some other stuff soon.